and welcome to Zoom with Czarny. I'm Dustin Czarny, Democratic Elections Commissioner of Onondaga County, and this is my interview show. Today's guest is Ben Weinberg of Citizens Union, and we're talking about even year elections. This has been a hot topic over the last couple of years. As you know, Onondaga County is involved in a lawsuit on it. But one of the major criticisms that came out from the other side and is that cities were not being moved, only towns and county offices, and that's because a constitutional amendment needed to be uh, entered into before we could move cities and judicial candidates. Well, that constitutional amendment was introduced recently by Senator Skoufis, and so we are. I wanted to bring Ben Weinberg of Citizen Union on it. He's been one of the main advocates for moving the New York City elections to even years, and and also judicial elections. So we have a great talk about how this is going to happen, if it's going to happen, and how long it's going to take. So please stay tuned for that. We are now in the middle of the June primary and village election season. We have a Liverpool village election going out and on June 19th, and then the June primary for Democrats for SD 50 and New York 22, and Republicans for Lysander Town Council and SD 48. Those are the main races. There's some small town committee races that I'm not going to really get into on this podcast, but those are the main elections. And absentee ballots have gone out this week for the congressional or for the primary on June 25th, and the village election just started to get finalized, and we'll be sending out absentee ballots for the village election in Liverpool. The village election in Liverpool is a little weird. There's two Republicans running for re-election and no Democrats challenging them, but there is a proposition on the ballot to move to the November election cycle, like we saw in Baldwinsville and Fayetteville this last election. So this time it was done by the board, put it on as an action. As you know, last year, 3 Democrats took over the control of the Liverpool Village Board, and they moved the elections to be run by the Board of Elections, and then put on this referendum to have it moved to November. So it'll be up to the voters, even though there's not a race for the village trustees, although a write-in race could happen. There is still this interesting question. So we'll be covering that in a future Zoom with Czarny. That being said, I want to get you to my interview with Ben Weinberg of Citizens Union. We talked about the new constitutional amendment for the even year elections. Enjoy. And we're back, and I'm very happy to have my friend Ben Weinberg. Ben Weinberg is works with Citizen Union, a nonprofit activist group based in New York City, but has been working all over the state on the even year election bills. And there's a lot of movement going on there, but we'll get to that in a second. Ben, thanks for coming on Zoom with Czarny.
Thank you, Dustin. It's always such a pleasure to be here. Thank you. And I love being on, and I have to listen to your podcast. So it's great to be on.
That's good. You and a couple dozen other people listen to my pod. So
I'm one of them.
You're one of them. Good, good. Well, Ben, why don't you've been on before, but why don't you reintroduce yourself to the audience? What's your title at Citizen Union? And tell us a little bit about what Citizen Union is.
Sure. So my name is Ben Weinberg. I'm the director of public policy at Citizens Union. And Citizens Union is a non-profit, non-partisan watchdog, an independent watchdog, or a good government group. So what does that mean? That means we work to promote issues like better elections, more participation in government and in elections, campaign finance reform, so getting money out of politics, having a stricter and better oversight over ethics in city and state government, issues like lobbying reform, improving accountability of our elected officials. In New York City, we work on police accountability as well. Um, on redistricting reform, when that is relevant, of course, and really everything that has to do with improving our city and our state government for the benefit of all New Yorkers. Now, Citizens Union is a pretty old good government group. We've been around for over 125 years, so its origins is in like the progressive era and reformist movements of the late 19th century. It was really set up to kind of fight the party bosses. But so we're still in the game of kind of improving democracy for all New Yorkers.
So, speaking of improving democracy, I know Citizen Union has not just a legislative agenda in Albany, but also in New York City as well, because you
Mhm.
are kind of a city-based group, but you've been branching out. You know, and we're going to get to the even year legislation in a little bit, but let's talk about some of the other things that you're working on. What are some bills that you're hoping that might pass the legislature this year, or the New York City Charter or New York City Council that you're
Mhm.
working on?
Yeah, that's a great question. We are indeed a city-based group focused on city, but work a lot in Albany. So I can start with the city council actually. So now a lot of our work at the city level is focused on issues related to ethics reform, campaign finance reform, lobbying reform. There are a couple of bills that we're really hoping to move. One of them is related to limiting lobbyists who also work on campaigns, who work as political consultants to campaigns. It's a very common, too common, I should say, practice where you have big lobbying firms that work both as lobbyists representing clients before city government and as campaign managers. They run campaigns, they fundraise for campaigns. And what ends up happening is that some campaign manager gets a candidate into office, and the next day they lobby that person on behalf of other clients, which is an obvious conflict of interest. So that's one bill we're working on, and then we have other bills related to improving the city's campaign finance system, um, limiting again the ability of lobbyists to bundle donations, and making sure the rules around fundraising and bundling are you know, better at this point. That's maybe and on the state level, where the final weeks of session, I know we'll talk about the even year election, but we're also very hoping to see legislation that will require New York to join ERIC, which I'm sure you might have talked about in this podcast before. This is the multi-state system that allows election administrators around the country to kind of communicate and
No,
share
I'm
voter.
definitely in support of that.
Yeah.
My caucus came out, just the Democratic caucus on this one, but my caucus came out for it as well a couple years ago. It's and I've been working on, with some national groups, and I've talked to a lot of the secretaries of states in states that the Republican backlash against Eric was like in Missouri and some of these other states that loved the election administrators, the Republican election administrators in those areas loved Eric, and they are, Virginia, another one. They loved Eric, and now that they're out, they're really having issues, and I really see New York as an ability to kind of come in and save Eric, be a big state that comes in
Hmm.
and really be a big part of, hopefully some of these other states will come back to the fold. We're always waiting for the fever to break on election denial, but maybe still a couple years away. But until then, New York and really California need to step up to the plate and get into this.
And this will help New York substantially. I mean, we know that New York has issues with voter rolls, and we don't have the best voter rolls in the country, I would say. This should be an interest of Democrats, Republicans, Independents, and really everyone that are interested in a kind of better election administration and smoother smoother voter registration.
So You talked a little bit about redistricting reform only because I'm
Yeah.
always really curious about what are you doing on redistricting reform with Citizens Union?
Whew. So look, we're just coming out of brutal and and chaotic and multi-year redistricting process, which I think no one was pleased by. Um, we and along with a few other election reformers, good government groups, advocacy groups are trying to come up and develop a joint platform for redistricting reform that would prevent New York from going through the same chaotic redistricting cycle that we saw playing out in the last 2 years. I think there were some beneficial elements to how we did redistricting in last years. For example, because we have a relatively new language in the Constitution that bans partisan gerrymandering, and a court that was willing to put a stop and draw the line on gerrymandering. Now it is clear to all sides that they cannot just draw the lines to fit whatever political wills and wishes they have at that moment. So I think that is maybe the positive side, but definitely the way this has been drawn out and the issues around getting to an agreement within the Independent Redistricting Commission exposed major problems in our process, and we need to fix it before 2030.
Yeah, I mean the the independent redistricting commission. I was never a fan of the makeup in 2012. I know a lot of people thought, "Hey, it's better than what we had," and it maybe. There at the end of the day, we did finally get maps, but there was such a uh almost like a designed to fail mechanism in there
Mm,
when everybody thought that the legislature was going to be broken up forever. It's always going to be half Republican, half Democrat, and nobody really thought the Democrats going to take over. And then when they did, it left the Republicans with the only move they had was to break the commission and go to court, and it only lasted for 2 years. It was a lot of work.
mhm,
And we're redistricting again this year, and it's it's been, I think at the end of the day, the maps that we finally got out of it are decent. They're not
mhm,
horrible. I mean, they're better than probably what we would have got if it was just three men in a room doing it. But
mhm,
the process needs to be cleaned up. But I promised that we would get to the even year legislation, and that's why I had you back. Now, I need to put out there. We'll talk a little bit about the legislation that happened last year, and we're not going to talk about the court case because I'm a member of that court case. I'm a defendant and an active member in it. So I can't talk about the court case. I would
of
love to,
course.
but I can't. I would love to talk about, people using public money to do this court case, but I promised my lawyer I wouldn't. So,
I won't ask you.
okay, good. Uh, but let's talk about what did get passed last year
Sure.
that is causing this court case, and then some news on some future steps that are coming up.
Mhm.
So, the even year legislation that got passed last year at the end of session, what was it? What's it going to do?
Yeah. So that is a bill that was passed in June of 2023 and was signed into law by Governor Hochul in the last few days of the year in late December of 2023. Um, what this bill does is that it requires all elections in county offices and town offices. I should say almost all. There are very minor exceptions there. But we're talking about things like county executive, county legislator, town supervisor, and the like. Um, it will require all these elections to be held on an even numbered year, sorry, starting from 2026. Now, that does not mean that all of these elections, like all town elections and all county elections, are going to happen in November 2026. The bill established a mechanism of how to kind of gradually move from one election cycle and election calendar to the next. Two important elements of that mechanism. I don't want to bore our audience too much, but one is that this will not impact any incumbent who is currently in office or who was in office in the day that legislation was passed. Meaning, I think it would be, of course, unfair to cut a person's term in the middle and unfair toward that elected official and the voters who elected them. So it does not impact folks who are in office. Um, and then it shortens the term of the next person who is elected on an odd numbered year, shortens that term, and the way it shortens the term depends on the current election cycle in that jurisdiction. So some cases it's between from 3 to 2, 4 to 3, 2 to 1. I don't have the list in front of me, but essentially all the different jurisdictions will gradually, slowly move towards an even numbered year election cycle, starting from 2026 and up to 2030, if I remember correctly. Meaning
That's
like
right. Yep.
starting
It's
right.
going, it's really starting in 2026 is the first time where some people are going to get 1 year terms or I'm sorry, 2025. Uh,
Hmm.
some of those people will get 1 year terms to run again in 26. And then some people in 2027 or in 2025 will get 3 year terms to run in 2028. And then some people will wait till 2027 and get 3 year terms to run in 2030. The mechanism is a little complicated, but basically we're talking about town elected officials, county legislators, county-wide elected officials, except for DA,
Right.
sheriff, and county clerk.
Hmm.
And that's the criticism, right? And
Hmm.
villages weren't touched, and cities weren't touched because
Hmm.
that's the criticism. And I thought it was bad faith criticism because the criticism they knew and everybody else knew that to do those other ones, we actually had to do a constitutional amendment,
Hmm.
which takes longer. Um, but that's the news that happened over the last couple of weeks. Senator Skoufis, working with your office, has introduced, as promised, the first part of the constitutional amendment. It's got to be passed this session and in a future session, and then be put on the ballot by voters. But what is this constitutional amendment going to do?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So as you mentioned, that the bill that was passed last year kind of left off a number of different offices, which are currently still being run on odd numbered year elections because the New York State Constitution prevents making that change through state law. So what this proposed constitutional amendment does is it amends, changes several provisions in the New York State Constitution to require those other officers to be elected in November of even numbered years. So what offices are these? Of course, the big one is cities. So according to the New York State Constitution, this has been around since the late 19th century, in fact. All cities in New York State, and it doesn't matter if it's New York City or a small city that is smaller than a village sometimes, all cities in the state are required to hold their elections in an odd numbered year. The Constitution literally says odd numbered years. So this proposed amendment will just change that to be elected in an even numbered year. But it also requires other offices to be elected in even numbered years. So that includes judges. Judges under the Constitution currently have set terms. So, some judges have 14-year terms or 12-year term, and the Constitution also lays out exactly how you fill a vacancy in a judicial office. So, you cannot really move those elections to an even numbered year unless you fix those mechanisms. So, under the proposed constitutional amendments, all judicial offices, elected judicial offices, obviously will be elected in an even numbered year. Some what's called law enforcement offices, which you mentioned before. So that's county clerk, district attorney, sheriff will also be moved to an even numbered year. and the process to fill a vacancy is also there, right? So almost all vacancies, um, the election will have to be done in an even numbered year. The constitutional amendment, the proposed constitutional amendment, um, empowers the legislature to come up with a mechanism for that transition. So that's not going to be in the Constitution itself, but the Constitution will say the legislature may enact laws to provide for that transition.
And that goes for the judges too. Is that the
Indeed.
because for the viewer listener, we've talked about this before. Judges, DA, county clerk, and sheriff, when they're elected for a full term. And if a vacancy happens midterm, when that next election happens, it's also for a full term. So it actually moves the election. We have that in Onondaga County. Our county clerk used to be elected on the presidential cycle, and then a clerk decided to retire on an odd year, surprisingly. And it moved the county clerk to the odd year cycle after Democrats almost took that seat in 2012. And then in 2015, they moved it to the odd year cycle, but Democrats have recently taken that seat. So it took a little while. But so that wouldn't happen anymore. They would have to have some kind of either to fill vacancy election like every other office, or maybe an appointment, depending on what the legislature comes out to, where an appointee can come in or a deputy can come in and take it over for a couple of years. But that would only be determined once the amendment passes. Then the legislature would have to basically pass enabling legislation for that vacancy fill, is what you're saying.
So in fact, there's the same day we had the proposed constitutional amendment introduced, we also had that enabling legislation introduced. You can theoretically, and that will probably be what will happen, you can pass it even before the amendment goes into effect, even before voters vote on that amendment. The bill just says, it will go into effect if and when the amendment goes into effect. So we already have that bill introduced, and we have a bill number for that as well. And I can talk a bit about the mechanism of transition, but it's essentially it does the same. It really provides the same transition mechanism that we saw in county and towns, more or less, where terms are shortened by 1 year in almost all cases, depending on the term, and incumbents are not affected by it. But
So
I wanted.
so let's talk about that, because I actually thought one of the great changes in the even year legislation that Scoofus put in, it almost passed the year before, and I think there was a lot of changes that made it pass the next year. And one of the great changes was the staggering effect, that it wasn't like tomorrow we're going to make this change. And I think he listened to a lot of the election administrators that were talking about the need to work with our vendors, come up with different ballot sizes, and kind of like be the frog in the pot a little bit, in a good way, and like let us work up to it each year instead of saying, okay, tomorrow we're doing this. And it's weird because usually election legislation that gets passed in New York is like, tomorrow, go ahead, early voting. We passed it in January. We didn't even pass the electronic poll books till April. And by the way, in November we have to do it. And like that was the 2019 battle. But now this is a phased in. So is this amendment phased in a similar way?
That's correct. So the transition mechanism will be phased in a similar way, where the moment the amendment goes into effect, the folks in office that day will not be impacted. They will be able to complete their term as they wish. And so that there will be one more odd numbered year election after that amendment goes into effect. But whoever wins that election, their term will be shortened. So it results in the same gradual process that you are referring to, because it depends on the year where a city or whoever or whatever office holds their election currently. So I'll give you an example from New York City, which will be, of course, the biggest jurisdiction to be impacted by this change. If we pass, the earliest we can pass this, we can bring it before voters and pass it in a referendum is 2026. It can also pass in 2028. I assume this will come in an even year election, and an even year election to the voters, because it will make no sense to bring it to an odd year
Yeah, we
election.
kind of
But
learned our lesson with the early
that's right.
with the same day registration and the no excuse absentee. I don't think anybody's putting a major ballot question on in an odd year anymore.
That's right. So let's say the voters passed it in 2026. In New York City, the next municipal election will happen in 2025, which means that in November of 2026, when this amendment will pass, folks in office, and that will be the mayor, comptroller, 51 council members, everyone who will be elected in 2025 will be able to finish their term. The term ends in December 2029. And then that next election in 2029 will be for a shortened term, which will end in 2032. Meaning New York City will theoretically elect an even year mayor, let's call it, in 2032. So it's even more gradual than the process we were talking about with county and town election, because we have this constitutional amendment built into it, which, just takes a while. So I think in terms of preparing election administration, and even voters and campaigns and, the entire state of New York, preparing it for this change, which I know is a substantial, transformative change. We'll have literally, we have like almost a decade, like 8 years before it actually begins. So, this is, I think, a helpful part of this package, that this is not an immediate effect. We're talking long term, we're planning long term.
Yeah, and so that would mean like we see another, again, it would be like a decade long. Every year somebody is being added, which is, again, I think the best way to do this, because we're going to learn lessons every cycle that we do this.
Mm-hmm.
Ballot length is going to get longer and longer. We're going to have to, we're talking about it won't be completed till 2032 to 2034 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a decade from now. We're going to have new voting equipment. We're going to have new,
Mm-hmm.
that changes every 10 years. And that allows our vendors to know what they have to give us to be ready to go in 2032, and also as we're going along this whole line. So, again, I think that's well designed. But there is one thing, there is still one office left out of this, and that's villages. And
Correct.
I know, we have in Onondaga County, we have this little village transition to better elections in November, is how I like to put it. But there's always a little rigmarole around that. And there's a lot of people very active about, like, why is New York State not dealing with the villages, which
Mm-hmm.
have these weird elections in March and easily can move to November, and whether it's odd or even years. So the even year elections was A New Hope, Star Wars A New Hope, and the constitutional amendment is Empire Strikes Back. So Return of the Jedi is another piece of legislation that is being crafted right now, right?
Correct. Return of the Village Jedi. That's the third part of this trilogy. I think, yes. I know that Senator Skoufis again is interested in doing that as well, and they are working on that legislation. What I'll say is that this takes time, and not only to pass it, it takes time to craft and draft the right bill, in the most sensible way that will not, will help voters, but also help election administrators like yourself and commissioners and the towns themselves, sorry, villages themselves. So they are working on it, and I expect us to see that in the future.
Yeah, and that does not need a constitutional amendment. That could just be done via election law changes. So that might actually happen a little bit quicker, maybe.
Hmm,
If we can get that worked out. Probably not this session, because if it hasn't been introduced yet,
that's right.
it's not going to be introduced before the end of session. But maybe next year we might see how things go on.
That's
So well, we're kind of getting towards the end of what I like to have as a length for this podcast, but I like to end on my favorite lazy question, which is what haven't we talked about? What out there? Floor is yours. You can talk about your dog, your baby. I know you got a 3-month-old baby at home,
I do, I
or
do.
or a topic that we haven't talked about, or even more detail on something that we already had. The floor is yours, Ben.
Yeah, thank you, Dustin. Although I talk about my new baby all the time, so I'm not gonna bore voters, viewers on that. But I think the one thing we haven't touched on related to this policy, which is always for me very important to highlight, is that not only that it will boost turnout, that it will reduce gaps in participation, racial gap, age-based gaps, and will do a lot, I think, for our local democracy. It is also supported by voters, by and large, by like everyone, everyone. And by that, I mean, we have seen national surveys that show 70% support for holding our local elections on even years and moving them to even years. And that's support from Republicans, Democrats, and independents. We've seen, we had a Siena College uh, survey of New York State voters that showed very strong support for the bill that passed last year. Again, support among all groups surveyed, including Republicans, including independents, including Democrats. Just last week, it might have been a couple of weeks ago, we had a first survey of New York City voters. The first time we have the opinion of only New York City voters on this specific policy. So they were asked, will you support moving city elections to coincide with federal elections? And we saw the support was even higher than across the state, right? So we saw a net gain of 42%. That means that we saw over 60% support and less than 20% opposition. And interestingly, that support came from all age groups, racial and ethnic groups, Republican, Democrat, independents, education levels. Highest level of support was actually among 18 to 29 years old, who support this policy by over 70%. We know why, because this will help young people and really raise their turnout in local elections. So and across the nation, we see this happening. We've seen laws similar to these passed in California, blue states, in Nevada, and in purple state, I'd say, in Arizona by a Republican legislator. Montana just last year passed, almost made it into a law, passed two different bills in the upper and lower house there, and they plan to bring it back for one unified bill in the next session. So this is a trend, and we're talking long term. We're talking about something that will, happen, as we said, in like 8, 10 years. By then, we'll see more states joining, more cities joining, and this idea will be normalized and clear for even more voters. So we're very glad to see that broad support, and we're very positive about the chances of this moving forward.
Yeah, and I know a lot of people say, well, what will you do in the elections board if you don't have an election each year? Well, there's a lot of states that don't have elections in their odd years. I was
Mm-hmm.
talking to a Hawaii administrator at one of my
Mm-hmm.
conferences who doesn't do that. And the work of the Board of Elections still goes on. We still have
Mm-hmm.
campaign finance. We still have, data entry for the voter registration. We still have to do our LNA testing and our equipment testing. And that's not stuff that just, when I got elected, people said, oh, great, you only have to work 2 days a year. Then I don't think I've had 2 days off in a week and since
Yeah,
then. So, it's been there's a lot of work to elections. People just don't realize it. And of
that's
course,
right.
there will always be a special election or something like that. And
That's right.
again, 10 years from now, we'll adjust. When everything has moved, we will then adjust, and we'll adjust staffing, we'll adjust a lot of different things, to make it work. So
That's
Ben,
right.
I just want to thank you for coming on. I'll put Citizen Union in the notes. You can go there, follow them on the social medias, but also check out their website and check out all the initiatives that they have. They got a lot of good white papers and stuff like that around there. So, but Ben, thank you for doing the work you do, and thank you again for coming on Zoom with Czarny.
Thank you, Dustin. It's always a pleasure. I'm looking forward to continue the conversation on this.
And that was my interview with Ben Weinberg of Citizens Union. And we got a long way to go with this even year election bill. It's going to take a lot of turns, but this is the latest iteration, so I wanted you to hear from him. This week, weekly wonk. This weekend, I'll be doing Senate District 48. I did Senate District 50 this last weekend. Senate District 48 has a primary for the Republican challenger to face Rachel May. So that's why I'm doing that district next. And then I will be doing Commissioner in the Car on Tuesday. We'll be talking about, actually, I think the Commissioner in the Car next week will be on Monday. And the reason it'll be on Monday is I want to talk about school district elections that are happening on the 21st, which is Tuesday. So a special Commissioner in the Car on Monday instead of Tuesday. And then my Zoom with Czarny next week will be with a new guest on my program, Tom Speaker of Reinvent Albany. He's another democracy advocacy group, and we'll be talking about what he's doing, not just on elections. He's actually got a lot of great proposals. His group has a lot of great proposals. We'll talk about what that group does, and it's one of my things is to keep bringing you democracy advocates and public interest groups out there that are not just partisans, that are out there doing the work of making our government better. So I'm happy to have him on for the first time next week. So stay tuned. Thank you very much. And remember, you can always go to dustinczarny.com and get all of your information regarding content and election news. If you sign up to subscribe, you'll never have to pay anything. I never do ads. I never take outside money. That website is my own design and my own work as part of my outreach as my role as elections commissioner in Onondaga County. Thank you very much and have a good weekend. Bye-bye.